which one you want to do the full project on. That's okay. That's all right. So, what I will do next Thursday, regardless of your choices, is put an announcement on Brightspace with like, here's the recording from the summer, here's the assignment, and here is the discussion board if necessary. So I will, next Thursday at 1 o'clock or whatever, next Thursday probably at 9 a.m. or whatever, it'll appear in Brightspace, the lecture and all the information. So we just won't be meeting live. Does that make sense? All right, so that was my big announcement. Otherwise, does anybody have any questions about the course or about how we're moving through these topics? Or it looks like people are engaging on the discussion board. Everything I've seen is fine. So I know there's no like grades on the discussion board, but I can just say verbally that all the people who have been posting, especially the project people posting, your stuff has been great. It's been fine. And to those of you commenting, and thank you for talking to your fellow students about what their research is uncovering. That's all going perfectly fine from my side. So, all right, then if nobody's dying to ask any other questions or has confusion, we can switch to the computer and to our topic for today. So this week's social problem, the family itself is not the problem. Well, it depends on the family, I suppose. But what the topic is problems that affect or are affected by the institution of families in society. So I want to start with a few definitions of what we're talking about when we talk about families. And then we'll move on to talk about the way problems either are affected or affect families. So family is one of those words that we use in everyday English that might, in ways that might be different from like legal or other definitions of a family. You don't have to write these down. These aren't in the notes, I don't think, but it's just trying to show you like so many different kinds of combinations of people, adults and children, can be families, right? A man and a woman and their children, maybe the traditional nuclear family idea, right? But we also use the word family to talk about bigger extended family, right? Grandparents, uncles, cousins. What about a couple who gets married but chooses or for whatever reason cannot have children? Does that, are they still a family? Of course, right? What about a single parent who has children? Is that a family? Of course, right? So the idea is lots of different combinations of things, of people and relationships make different kinds of families. But when it comes to official definitions, sociologists tend to draw a distinction between people's subjective definition of a family and then like the legal definition of a family, right? So the subjective or personal definition of what constitutes a family is usually a definition that deals with like the emotional or social connections we have to other people. So like if someone just came up to you on the street and said, who is in your family? Like the people that you would respond to that person with by answering, for me it would be my parents, my siblings, my husband, my nieces and nephews, right? Like that would be my family. But someone might be not have parents, but they might have a very close-knit group of friends, and they might call them their family, right? So a subjective definition of families is much more acknowledging of that emotional connection. Whereas the legal definition of a family varies, by country, and sometimes by state, but it's usually more restrictive than like people you feel emotionally close to. And it tends to only include those who are related to us by birth, marriage, or adoption. So all three of which are somewhat legal categories, birth being the messiest one, I suppose, but yeah. birth is also a legal, being someone's parent or child is a legal status, right? But marriage, of course, I'm speaking here of the legal contract of marriage, not a religious ceremony. And adoption, of course, is a legal status. And so the official definition of family tends to be people who are related on by one of these three categories. Does that make sense? But of course, colloquially, we use the word family to mean more relationships than just these, perhaps. The census, the U.S. Census's official definition reflects that birth, marriage, or adoption idea. So the U.S. Census Bureau defines a family as two people or more related by birth, marriage, or adoption and residing together. Yeah. So the census includes a shared household as a family to ensure that it counts every individual only once. Right? So let's say you have a family where the parents, a nuclear family, 2 parents, 2 kids, and the parents get divorced, and the mother no longer resides with the family, right? If the mother, so every household gets sent a census in the mail, so the mother's going to get a census at her apartment or wherever she is, and the father and the 2 kids is going to get a census at that house. So if they both report the mother as part of the family, right, then she gets counted twice. You see? So that's the logic behind why they require a shared household. The U.S. Census ties individuals to households for the way it collects data. The other thing I want to point out is the 2 or more, right? So it does just have to be 2 people to be a family. It does not have to, it could be 2 adults and no children, or it could be a parent and child but not a married couple, or whatever, right? It can be as small as 2.
So the Census Bureau definition is different than the legal definition?
Correct.
And wrong.
You mean it does not incorporate, or it under measures.
Exactly. It's not my sisters or my family because we don't put anything.
Right. So extended families would not count as a census level family. That is correct.
For the sole purpose of counting.
Correct. So family scholars, people who study families in sociology and psychology, whatever, don't use the census for a lot of their data.
Oh, no.
for obvious reasons, right? Because it's designed to be a population count more so than a accurate depiction of a family. So, but yes, it is inaccurate.
And also, they don't include, like, my partner and he and I are not married, so we wouldn't be considered family accurate.
Right, you are not related by birth, marriage, or adoption, you and your partner, technically.
It seems to me that we might have the technology to stop those problems from happening, that we don't have
To account for them?
Yes, we don't have to, like, piss people off.
Yeah.
If we would, like, if they said, or adoption, and if this is to, or adoption.
Or instead of...
If it wasn't the...
Except then, we would also capture roommates in that definition of a family. But I hear you. Like, so there's pros, it's like a lesser of evils thing, and I don't know what the right way to do it is.
I can't really imagine living with someone that I don't.
I've had roommates that were of convenience.
Oh, I've had roommates that I have not liked at all.
Yeah.
I couldn't live with someone.
Right. Well, I'm not saying it was a long-term situation, but yeah.
Like, you can sleep on the couch for a couple of nights, but then you've got to go.
Yeah.
I feel like though, they could rework the language in a way that it was.
That's fair. And as you get, this was last updated in 2016, right? Every 5-10 years they revisit their definition, so we're ready. It's ready for that. That's fine, and that's why I included this, because I thought it would be interesting to show you, so we understand the personal idea of who we think our family is, and we understand the sort of legal way of defining a family, but those aren't the only ways. And
isn't that kind of the crux of what all the problems are?
Shared meaning.
How to define something that means something different to every person.
Absolutely. So that's a symbolic interactionist argument, right? That if we don't have shared meaning, we can't proceed, right? And that is largely, arguably, the base of a lot of social problems, right? So yes, a very symbolic interactionist approach, but a correct one in my opinion. So there's also difference in the way we talk about families as a society. So like the book describes it as a difference between the private and public views of the family, which sounds weird, but what I mean by that is, like, you can think about your family when you hear the word family and be like, oh yeah, my family. Or you could think about the abstract concept of the family in the United States today, right? Like that concept of a family. And that's the difference here. The private view of the family is an individual's view of their own family. Your own personal judgment of how well your family meets your needs and who is part of it and to what degree they are successfully being a good family member, right? But then there is the public view, and I don't mean the way your family presents themselves to the world. I mean the big idea of the family, right? Approached as a social institution in society. So when you hear somebody say like, the role of the family in society today is declining or whatever. Like, you're not talking about your family, you're talking about the family. Does that distinction make sense of micro, macro?
Yeah, I would say micro,
Sorry.
macro.
Yeah, exactly. Micro is your family. And so like we're going to talk about a lot of problems today. Some of them I think might apply to my family. Some of them don't. Right? But all of them apply to the concept of the family in society. An emphasis in this public view of the role families play in the functioning of society.
Once again, this is where a lot of problems could also come about because of the public view of the family versus your own view of the family.
And to your point, or your personal view of how social problems are and how they affect you versus whether they're structural problems, like whether they're family related or not, for that matter. So I always see people in the comments section of articles being like, I don't know anybody who got sick from this thing, so therefore it's not a social problem, right? Like, anecdotally saying, I don't know anybody this affects, so therefore it doesn't affect anybody.
Or the definition of family itself from a social institution perspective, because one of the first things you said was, what is a family?
Yeah.
And the second and last one is same-sex couples. Well, half the world, that's
not a family, right?
So that would be an issue, so from that standpoint versus social institution versus their own.
Right, absolutely. So yes, the view of who you think of as a family and how it functions and what it does can be very different from the institutional view. And how society believes a family is or should be or whatever. So yes, absolutely. I got you there, sorry. So specifically, so we do have a course, by the way, that studies the family specifically in social science. It's called, it was previously called Sociology of Families, but in the spring it's had its name changed to Families and Society. Because it's no longer just a sociology class, it's a social science class, so it's being taught in the spring by Dr. Patrick Cheek, who has a degree, his PhD is in family studies. Like, it's not just sociology. So, sociology is cool and part of it, but he's actually a psychologist by training, so it'll be like a social psychological look at families and society. So for anyone who's interested, that is SSC 3-something, reaching, I want to say 325, I think it's 325, but you can search for Families and Society in Main Street and register for it starting on Monday if you are non-degree seeking. Alright, anyway, that's the plug there. Moving on, this class is not Sociology of Families, it is Social Problems. So let's talk about how problems relate to families and how families relate to problems. The book kind of separates issues into 3 categories, 3 different ways to think about the relationship between families and problems. So the first way is to think about families themselves and the way that they are organized in society or not organized in society as they themselves being a social problem. We can view certain kinds of families or certain ways families function as they themselves being social problems. We'll we'll get there. The second way is that family problems that families face as a family, can also be seen as social problems, right? Like domestic violence, for example, right? A problem that happens within a family can also be viewed as a social problem, right? And then the third way is that big social problems that affect all of society in some form, social problems can affect families specifically, right? So like poverty, right? Poverty is a social problem in general, but it can also affect families specifically. Does that kind of make sense? These three, not philosophical approaches, but just three different lenses from looking at families and problems. Sometimes the family is the problem, sometimes the problems the family has are bigger problems, and sometimes bigger problems can affect families. So let's start with the first one, families as social problems. What this refers to is this idea that the society has expectations for what a good kind of family is or should be, and not all families fit that mold, right? So this has to do with the fact that what a family is ultimately socially constructed. Yes, there's a legal definition. Yes, there's a census definition. Yes, but our concept as a society of what a family is socially constructed. It's created through interactions with others. And so in the United States in 2021, right, there are aspects of families that are socially constructed. What I mean by that is, for example, our ideas about what constitutes a family. So our 150 years ago, a single parent raising children may not have been considered a family, right? Regardless of the reason for single parenthood. It could be, death, it could be divorce, it could be any number of things. But single parents, especially single mothers raising children, were often not classified as a family in the same way they were. The woman became dependent again and got classified back with her parents as a family, right? You mentioned, and in the first slide I mentioned same-sex couples, right? For many years legally not considered families, and socially I think it's more acceptable of that, a family that is headed by a same-sex couple, or a non-cis hetero, type of family head, but also adults without children, or various other constructions have expanded over time. The other part of what gets socially constructed by a family is not just what constitutes a family, but what a good family is and does. Not just in terms of membership, but in terms of action, right? What does a good family do? Our ideas about ideal families and intimate relations. Our understanding of what a good family is, or what a caring family is, right? Or whether a family should be caring at all. 200 years ago, that wasn't a family's job to be caring. It was to, keep you alive and then send you off to work somewhere, right? Or, in royalty and the aristocracy, family was all about just giving you a name and an inheritance. It wasn't about love and support, right? In fact, I'm pretty sure parents were, back in the 19th century, parents were discouraged from hugging and kissing their children, their babies, because maybe a disease thing too, but you've heard this too, yeah. Well, and that too, right? Especially men, certainly wouldn't want to give any comfort to them, but it was no, you gotta make them tough. They're not gonna get hugs and kisses out in the world, and babies.
Just a baby.
Yeah. This was before child development psychologists figured out the monkeys liked the comfy moms, or no, the wire, whatever it was, yeah. Anyway, so the point is, right, these things have changed over time, which is a clue that what a family is less about biology and more about the social factors that surround it, right, and what we think they are. Related to families, something that is often discussed and often courses in the family also cover the concept of marriage. Not because you need to have a marriage to have a family, of course, but because in social norms and in legal documents and things like that, marriage and families often go hand in hand. So like the norms surrounding marriage often tie very directly to the norms surrounding families. So just like there have been shifts in how we construct ideas about families, there's also been cultural shifts over the last 100 years in marital expectations. For much of human history, marriage was an economic arrangement, right? And was worldwide. That's how marriage was seen, right? It was an economic arrangement, and people believed marriage, it was foolish to, care about romance or something as fleeting as love when you're making a lifelong economic commitment to somebody, right? And so people selected marriage partners not based on emotion, but based on like what they could contribute to a family. That we can mean that literally, like in the case of a dowry or whatever, like what can this woman provide to this potential spouse, but also just the idea of, marriages being alliances and being much more calculated than based on romance. And because of that, for centuries, and even today, there is a sociological principle that is still exists called homogamy. Homogamy. So homo means same, right? Like homogeneous is all the same. Homogamy is the practice of marrying people who are educationally and economically similar to us, like who have roughly the same education level and are roughly the same social class. Now, I'm not saying that people who are rich and poor can't marry each other, or someone with no, degree and someone with a PhD can't get married. Of course they can. But a sociological principle we have seen over centuries and centuries of human life is that people tend to marry people who are like themselves. And that arguably comes from the fact that it was much more of a calculated arrangement than it was love. Love, you'd see people of all different kinds, marrying each other all over the place. There'd be no trend, right? But what we see is, people were often class-oriented, right? There's a little bit of chicken and egg idea here too. Like, are you more likely to associate with people, if you are raised in a middle-class household, the people you're going to hang out with are mostly going to be middle class. So that principle is called homophily, P-H-I-L-Y at the end there. And they're the same, right? If you're always hanging out with people who are like you, then of course you're more likely to marry somebody who's like you, right? Like, and then you have kids and they hang out with other people who are like them, right? I mean, it's and the point is humans are affiliative. We like people who are like us, and we marry them. Anyway. Does that concept make sense? Okay. So we've got social construction of the family. We've got marriage and what the purpose of marriage and family is kind of shifting over the last 100 years. Excuse me. We've also had changes in society to different family structures, right? And what the quote-unquote ideal family might be. So a family structure is where we talk about the people who comprise a family and their relationships. So like, I'm sure you've heard the term nuclear family before. I think I mentioned it already. A nuclear family is one kind of family structure. But so are blended families, right? The families who have had, past relationships, either marriages or whatever, and often have children from different relationships, or what could be termed step families, single parent families, cohabiting families, right? Families where the heads of household are not married. Lots of different kinds of family structures exist. The dominant family type in the U.S., both, statistically speaking, I'm not sure if it's still, more than 50% of households are nuclear. I think they are. But even if numerically it's not dominant, it is still the culturally dominant idea of a family. In the U.S., like, what do you see most often portrayed in the media? What do you see most often, policies and decisions being framed around, right? A nuclear family. In fact, the census definition is a clear example of that, where it reflects a culturally dominant idea of a nuclear family as being, this is what a family is. You must live together and be 2 parents and X number of kids. But of course, multi-generational or extended families have been historically the most popular type of family unit across the world and over time. And everybody has a different picture of what the ideal family is. And so societies are constantly trying to weigh, individuals' thoughts about what families are and should be, or just what they are. Like, we might have ideals about what we think a family should be, but then we live in reality, which is the family we have, right? And so navigating that distinction, and that difference. Any questions or comments about the term family structure? So, one statistic that is often talked about with relation to families and marriage is the idea that marriage rates have declined over the last several, 50 years, right, at least. So there are fewer marriages happening, right? So we call this marriage decline, a significant drop in the marriage rates. This is not the same as divorce. So the other thing people talk about is they think that the divorce rate is really high, right? We'll get there to talk about divorce in a few minutes, but that's not what I'm talking about here. This isn't about divorce. This is just the actual number of marriages that are done, every year. That number has been going down, right? So I'm not talking about divorce at all yet. But so here are the indicators that we are seeing as evidence of marriage decline. First, literally, there's a decreasing percentage of adults who marry. So when they survey, all the adults in the United States, are you married? The percentage of people saying, yes, I am, has gone down over time. People are also waiting longer before they get married for the first time, right? So the average age of your first marriage, 30 years ago was like age 19 for women, no, not 30, maybe 50 years ago, but 19 for women and 23, I think, 22 or 23 for men. And by the time I got married in the early 2000s, the average age for women was 25 and 29 for men, right? And I think it's even gone up a couple of years since then. So people are waiting longer before they get married. And then, even though I said this is not divorce, this is just the number of marriages, because people perceive divorce rates as being high, they often use that as a reason not to get married in the first place, right? So it's not the same people that are getting divorced that are being counted in marriage. Like, if you get divorced, then you've been married, so you're counted as being married. But seeing these divorce rates can make people choose not to get married at all, right? And even though we perceive divorce rates in the U.S. to be high, they actually reached their highest rate in the 1980s and have been on the decline ever since. So though we perceive divorce rates to be high, they're actually lower than they were in the past. And that statistic about half of all marriages ending in divorce, that's not true.
What is it?
It's like 19 to 20% on average across the whole U.S. It's depending on where you are, Washington, D.C., it's about 34%. That's about as high as it gets. No comment on why. And then I think it's lowest in one of the Dakotas. And it's like 14% or something there. It's so, yeah. It's in the 20, around the 20 mark.
Could we say that divorce rate could be declining because of the first two indicators of marriage decline?
Yeah, there's not as many marriages, there's not gonna be as many divorces.
People are waiting
That's-
longer.
It's not a rate.
It's still a rate, though. You were saying divorce percentage still means that if, that would not be affected by marriage.
Correct.
That's the thing.
It's a tricky, because the same people aren't the same ones.
You could argue that people who are deciding not to get married because of the high, what they perceive as the high divorce rate, would have divorced and therefore caused the divorce rate.
That's kind of what I'm talking
But
about.
that's like
The
a.
decreasing percentage of adults who marry, so they're more like,
Those people
so
would
the
have
people
more
that
likely
actually
to
do get married are more likely to stay together because they really want to get married.
Gotcha.
And you can't
And then
have
people-
divorce if you didn't get married.
Exactly.
You
And
just
then
break up.
the people waiting longer before marriage, they're sure.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
they're not getting married too young.
Yeah, no, I do too. So, right, if you never got married, if you just break up,
Yeah.
it's not included in.
It doesn't.
Right. Right. So it is, it's clearly, it's much more about what we perceive the divorce rate to be than it is about any actual effect of the divorce rate itself.
Like speaking to that, like my sister, who's in her mid-20s, had several friends who got engaged before COVID, and their weddings were supposed to happen
Over the last year or two,
over the
yeah.
last 2 years. And of the 5 friends, only 2 of them.
Eventually they decided to.
We're definitely postponed.
Mhm.
So that's,
Yeah.
that's kind of it.
Lots of people want to get married. Not everybody actually wants to be married, right? Like that or wants to have a wedding, doesn't necessarily want to be married, kind of thing too. Like, yeah, that's interesting. So when being forced to wait basically and think about it more.
I'm like someone like her one friend was very, very excited, and now her and her, they're not even together anymore.
Yeah.
It's kind of sad, but how there's a weird. Hope it saved them some money. It's
Yeah.
now they're not together. I mean, we went through this pandemic living together, stuck together for.
Yeah.
Now they know.
Yeah. It's kind of like being forced to cohabitate and then learn lessons. Oh, you chew like that? That's not gonna work.
That percentage would be interesting. How many people got divorced over the last 2 years compared to other years?
Oh yeah, so
If there was a spike with COVID, yeah.
I will fully admit that all my knowledge on the divorce rate is pre-pandemic. So I'm sure there's stuff being done, and it might be something that you can't really tell for a year or whatever. But I hear you. I wonder what all of these kinds of things, social indicators, how they've shifted based
One
on.
interesting thing is one of the most difficult things on marriage is renovations. And a lot of people
We're renovating.
during pandemic said nothing better to do. So they put themselves in the most stressful situation of locking a house. Probably not the best plan.
They were home 24/7. They weren't going to work. They weren't having any space.
Right.
So,
Oof.
And being stuck with the kids that you guys chose to have together.
Yeah.
But right, kids stuck at home. We're one of the major lessons we learned, family related over the pandemic, is how important childcare is, and how bad the system currently is because people couldn't work, they couldn't have functioning lives because their kids were not in school, or they were virtual school, but they still needed it laid that bare, I think, for a lot of people, which hopefully means there'll be change, but who knows.
Now, isn't the 50% thing with the divorce rate, isn't that more misleading because of the fact that they're counting people that get divorced multiple times?
They're not. So the divorce rate being 50% can be traced back to a statistic that came out in 2008, where they said that in 2008 there were 2.2 million marriages performed and 1.1 million divorces granted.
That's what it is. It's not the same people.
It's not the same people, right.
Yeah, they didn't mention that.
So in 2008, 2.2 million people got married and 1.1 million people got divorced. But the people who were getting divorced weren't from that 2.2 million. I mean, maybe a couple of them were. Maybe a Kardashian or whatever. But most of the people who got divorced that year were people who had been married in 2007, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, for decades, right? And so that's why when you do the actual correct numerator, that's where you get that 20% that I was mentioning before. I don't know what that number is off the top of my head, but so that's where that 50% came from. And I bet if you think back to people talking about half of all marriages, you can trace it back to the late 2000s as when people started talking about it. Because some dude, messed up the math, and the newspaper's headlines all grabbed it and ran with it. So there is also a good theoretical reason for why marriages have declined over the last 50 or so, 60 or so years, based on how we think about what marriage should be. So I'm going to give you this little paragraph, and then I'm going to explain it, the terminology in it. But basically, Max Sherlin, who's a family studies professor, he says that marriage has been deinstitutionalized, which means that institutional marriage gave way historically over time, gave way to a more companionate view of marriage, which has since evolved into an individualized focus on marriage. So if you think back to back in the day when marriage rates were about the highest, which was in the 40s and 50s and early 1960s, baby boom, part of that too, but marriage was thought of as still in that very old-fashioned way of it being a contract, right? Some of it was still economic, even though we had started kind of shifting into like the romantic idea. The institution of marriage is what was important in those relationships, like keeping up appearances, right? So even when a couple was unhappy, they would pretend to the public like the marriage is what was important, right? And they would protect that appearance, right? Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, yeah, that idea. So that was the institutional view of marriage, where the concept of marriage had to be held up to a standard. Eventually, whether it was because of the hippies and free love, or just because of general evolution of culture, as we got through the late 60s and into the 70s, that shifted away from that institutional appearances must be upheld idea to a more companionate view of marriage, where the couples were held together by sentiment, by love, or attraction, or even sexual compatibility, but something. But the couple was a couple, right? Because of that. Since then, into the 90s, 2000s, and the modern era, we now have a much more individualized focus on marriage, where what's important is the satisfaction of each individual in the relationship. And if even one of them is unsatisfied, it's much more likely that the relationship will end. It's more flexible to allow, if even one person is dissatisfied, for the marriage to end. So do you see like the philosophical shift that happened over 60 years, which could explain why people aren't getting married as often, or if they are, they're getting divorced or whatever, when the marriage was all that mattered, people were unhappy, but they weren't getting divorced, right? Then when it became about emotion and love, right, the divorce rate started to creep up, right? And then eventually people started, treating marriage as an individual choice. And so fewer marriages were happening, but also fewer divorces. Fair enough? All right, so then if we're just changing as a society, who cares if marriage rates are low? Why is that a problem? Well, sociologists and social scientists have argued that there are still social problems that can emerge when it comes to marriages declining. Some of them are wrong, as we'll see. So there is a school of thought that proposes that marriage is a solution for poverty. And it's based on a misunderstanding of how statistics work. So what people in this camp argue is they look at statistics and they say, gee, married people tend to report being happier, healthier, and wealthier than those who are not married. And that is true, right? That in census or in other polls, people are asked about, how happy are you, what's your income, blah, blah, blah. And the people who check the married box on average, when you crunch all the numbers, tend to have higher happy scores, higher health scores, and higher wealth scores. So a misunderstanding of how causation works, those things are correlated, but they don't cause each other, right? It's not because you're married you automatically get rich, right? It's not because you're married that you become healthy. It just so happens that the kind of behaviors that lead to healthiness also lead some people to choose marriage, right? So that was, a huge misunderstanding. But what the point is that there are actually groups of people who try to convince poor unmarried people to get married, as though that will solve their problems, or at least help. I'm not kidding. They go around to single, poor places where they can find poor single people and try to convince them to get married to solve the problem.
What places?
I don't know, where are they again?
I'm just curious.
Are they paying for, I don't know, singles bars?
I'm just picturing them going to like a homeless encampment.
Yeah,
Trying to
I saw that.
encourage people to get married, and you're like,
And then instantly your life will become better.
you want out of here, get married.
I can see how being in a committed relationship can help cause those things, but you have to have a starting baseline before.
Correct.
So for instance, two people that are on minimum wage could potentially produce more wealth
Oops, sorry.
and help each other out because now they're living together
Right.
and they're now taking on that burden together instead of separate. And then it
And some
it
things
builds
get
up
cut.
into something more. Now they
Yeah.
have more money. Now one of them can go to school.
Right.
And so on. So I can see how technically that's
There,
a causation, but
and
it's
that's the catch, right? Is there's a tiny grain of truth in it. So,
but
yeah.
it's not 100%. So
Right.
it's kind of one of those things where it's like, yeah, but you kind of have to have something first.
Yeah, just,
Those circumstances had to be there before the marriage for that to happen.
But without the marriage by themselves, they would not have been able to do it. So
right.
it's kind of, there is a causation, but it's not specifically just because they got married. They have to be.
The marriage certificate is not the cause.
Yeah, marriage is
yeah.
not the cause.
Yeah.
They have to still be a team.
Right, exactly. It's about everything that goes along with the marriage certificate, the partnership, the support, right, exactly. And
You could somehow have like a really nice wedding with a lot of games.
or maybe, yeah, it sets them up for a long time, and then there's a pandemic and they have to be around each other and can't go anywhere and do anything for 2 years.
There's a really good dowry involved.
Yeah. So, much more likely is the approach that our low marriage rates right now are actually a consequence of poverty. That because poverty is so significant for so many people, they are avoiding marriage, right? Poverty is the primary social problem. The solution to poverty is not likely to be marriage. Marriage doesn't solve poverty, right? Yes, married people do tend to be happier, healthier, but that's not what poverty isn't just about being happy, healthy, and wealthy, right? It's a structural problem that has to be solved first. So, it's an interesting way to think about it, but it does account for this connection between bigger social problems, as we'll see, and how they affect people at the family level.
But it's part of that problem because we changed our ideas on why we get married. As if it was an economic arrangement before, and now it's no longer an economic arrangement.
We can't expect it to fix.
You can't use it as part of the solution. So it's kind of one of those things where if it was still an economic arrangement between families, even if they're poorer families, it was used to help raise
Right.
as a whole.
You're poor, but you can bring this together. Yeah.
So it's kind of the thing where we don't look at it as an economic arrangement anymore, so therefore this is the consequence that led to that consequence.
I agree, and I think sociologists would agree, like that. The reason that marriage rates are low is because we aren't looking at marriage the same way, and because poverty has become such an issue that is not being addressed in a way it used to get addressed. Right. So yes, absolutely, very astute. Other questions about poverty and the marriage rate for now? We'll still talk about poverty in and of itself, like as a problem for families, but
What did it get up to in the 1980s when it was at its peak?
which the divorce rate?
Yeah.
People realizing that they could choose their own happiness.
What was the number? Like, was
What was the peak?
higher?
It wasn't 50. I know it wasn't 50, but I don't know what it was off the top of my head. Yeah. You could probably Google what was the highest divorce rate in the U.S. or something historically. I'll see at the break if I can find it. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so one of the other things we talked about as in terms of different types of families was same-sex couples, both marriages, marriage rate increasing as well as, having families. We talked about this under the auspices of sex and sexuality a few weeks ago before the midterm. But when it comes to specifically the examples of family, some groups in society argue that this increase in same-sex couples being married can produce social problems. The arguments they make, which are not supported by social science research, are that it threatens heterosexual marriage or that it somehow harms children. Like I said, there is not social science research that supports either of those claims. In fact, there is social science research that refutes the claim that same-sex marriages harm children. In fact, children's outcomes are just slightly statistically significantly higher to same-sex couple parents than heterosexual parents. Not a huge difference, but slightly higher in that direction. So those opponents have largely been, they haven't been silenced because they're very loud, but the evidence does not support those arguments. Instead, what we focus on is generational changes over time in support for same-sex marriage. So you remember the participation activity we did for the week that we talked about, section sex and sexuality, was about looking at different groups and their support over time for marriage equality. So we learned a little bit about that already, but basically by 2017, by 4 years ago, more than 2/3 of the U.S. supported marriage equality than opposed it. Or 2/3 supported it, so only 1/3 opposed it. Not that they matters because it is legally the case, but.
We also say that, yes, the marriages are increasing, but the relationships have always been. We're just acknowledging a marriage now.
Yeah, okay, so you're talking about, this sentence here?
Yeah.
Right. So, correct. More marriage certificates are being granted to same-sex couples, but that doesn't mean there's actually more same-sex couples than before, right?
I grew up in that era where my aunt had a roommate.
Yep.
A dear friend.
Correct, yes, yeah, right.
But
Confirmed bachelor uncle.
Yeah, the couples have always been there. We're just saying, oh yeah, you can be married now.
Correct. So the rates are increasing. All that means is the officialness of the relationships is increasing. I'm sure somebody's looking at informal versus formal relationships and whether there have been changes, or not, but yes, I hear that.
The whole concept of it threatening heterosexual marriage kind of relies on the fact that you think that just because it became legal,
it's lessening the other.
Homosexual people started getting together because of that.
Right.
That had nothing to do with it.
Well, I mean, come on. Marriage rates are decreasing, so obviously it's because same-sex couples.
Yeah.
I've actually heard that debate. I'm sorry.
Right,
that's why I laughed when you said that.
Yeah. So is the argument that because same-sex couples can get married, that makes it no longer worth it for opposite-sex couples?
I don't know, but that was the argument I was told. I was like, why would that affect your reasoning for getting married?
Oh, okay, yeah.
I laughed at them. It was outrageous. So.
I do understand why some people, religious-based, assume that having a marriage that doesn't meet their religious standard of what a marriage is, somehow I could see they could claim that it threatens them. I don't agree, but even that's a weak argument, and I don't think that's the one that we're talking about. So.
Well, the argument is usually that's what marriage was based on, and it wasn't. It was exchange of property.
Yeah.
And so marriage wasn't based on religious, ceremonies.
Economic and.
Yeah.
And so I've heard the argument a few times.
It's threatening this thing that we just came up with.
Right, and relative to our history, that's very true too, right? It's only been around for.
This brand new concept that we're going to start thinking of marriage at, that threatens it.
I think they think it threatens the institutional view of marriage, but we don't. A lot of things threaten that, like the march of time. and other things as well. So yeah. Good. So that brings me then to divorce specifically, and actually we've already talked about this, so I can move it a little bit quickly, which is that I already mentioned, so there's this true-false, the divorce rate in the U.S. is 50%. That is false. And in my notes, I just have divorce rates peaked in the early 1980s, and I don't have what number it was at. But anyway, the factoid about 50% comes from 2008. I'm not going to test you guys on this math, but 2.2 million marriages were performed, 1.1 million divorces were granted. But to accurately measure divorce, you'd have to compare the number of divorces, that 1.1 million, to the total number of all people who were married. Not just the people who had a 2008 wedding, but the people who had a 1960 wedding all the way up through a 2008 wedding. And so if you're ever doing research on the divorce rate, the correct measure, the one that measures everybody, technically it's called the refined divorce rate. So if you're ever Googling the divorce rate and you want the real one, Google the refined divorce rate, which takes into account all marriages that exist. The plain divorce rate is just the same year. All right. So anyway, based on this expectation or this thought that the divorce rate is 50%, people have tried to come up with a lot of ways to lessen divorce over time. One of those is a discussion about cohabitation. So cohabitation is living together before getting married, right? Or instead of getting married, or not without being married, I should say. Cohabitation is sexually or romantically involved unmarried people living together. And according to the census, that would still count you as a family because you're living together. You're just not related by marriage, but because you're romantically involved. Anyway, according to the U.S. Census, there are 18 million unmarried people living with a romantic partner in 2017, which is about a 30% increase over. I'm sorry?
You just said the census would still consider you a family?
They wouldn't because it's.
Oh, right, no, they wouldn't consider you, I'm sorry, you're right, they wouldn't consider you a family, but they do measure people who are single but live with a romantic partner.
Okay,
So you're right, I'm so sorry, but they would not classify you as a family.
gotcha.
I'm sorry, I did say that and I'm wrong just now, yeah, thank you. What I meant was the census does capture this information. They do ask about it. And so in 2017, there are about 18 million people who reported being unmarried but living with a romantic partner. Cohabitation was once widely viewed as a social problem. Like if you were my grandma, for example, she used the phrase living in sin. I don't know if anyone else's grandma did that. Yeah. Or so. An honest woman, yeah. And for a long time, that was how cohabitation was seen, was a dirty thing, a wrong thing to do, right? Although I think we would all agree public perception has shifted over generations.
Nowadays it's kind of.
No, public perception in the general sense, you still get judgment, right? Sometimes in certain circles, right? Oh, you're still living together, but you're not getting married. But I think it is gaining acceptance.
So, like in South Carolina, you can't get a divorce until you've lived separated for a year.
So you've lived separated.
So you have to live in separate domiciles for a year before you can get divorced.
To make sure you really want it?
I don't know, it's just you have to be apart for a year.
Interesting.
Imagine pledging to spend the rest of my life with someone before living.
No.
Well,
Well, in
okay.
this case, you're saying you have to live.
It's
I'm saying
So,
married.
like the whole thing of.
Right. Why wouldn't people go out
Cohabitation
together?
being a bad
Isn't
thing.
there a form? I don't believe it's in America anywhere, but in some countries, isn't there a law where if you live together for a certain amount of time with somebody of the opposite sex, you're automatically married?
That's common law.
So there is common law. States have different rules.
In France, like,
Yeah, I understand. I don't know if it's very common in the U.S.
It
We do?
It does exist in certain states. It does not exist in Maine, where people think it does. It does, but it does in New Hampshire. So if you just go over the mountains and live with somebody, but and it is, and it's different years in different places, and like sometimes it's you must own property together, sometimes it's not. there's weird rules about it, but yes, that is a thing that exists around the world where it's like marriage by default, right? Like, common law marriage is the term for it.
Is a common law marriage treated the same as a marriage?
Also depends on the state, to my knowledge. But hey, that's what it is living in a constitutional republic.
You have to be legally married to like make decisions like medically.
Right, you don't get those benefits. Yeah.
So I don't think it's exactly the same, but it also definitely depends on the state.
Just like a domestic partnership didn't grant the same things as a civil union, which didn't grant the same things as a marriage. So there's some other status in that realm.
I can definitely see somewhere in the South that would be like, if you're actually married.
Yes. We're counting you as married so that our, unmarried pregnancy rates don't look terrible or whatever.
That is part of it.
Yeah. It is. So our rates, the rates of pregnancy.
The people want to be, no, you're married now. And we're going to count you as married.
And therefore you're not a problem now.
You're not living in sin anymore.
So here's three pieces of, three attitudes that we measured between 2002 and then about 10 years later. I'll read them. So the first one is a young couple should not live together unless they are married. So what we're seeing is the first bar in the pairs is what they said in 2002. The second bar is what they said in 2012-ish. So men and women. So both men and women have decreased the number of people who say that you should not live together unless you're married. In other words, more people are okay with it now. The second one is it is okay for an unmarried female to have and raise a child. And you can see, again, both for both men and women, more people today agree with that, or in 2012, 10 years ago, than did 20 years ago. And then the last one, divorce is usually the best solution when a couple can't seem to work out their marriage problems. And those went down. People don't think divorce is necessarily the best solution.
I bet that would be different now.
Therapy.
10 years later, yeah.
Or with kids.
Yeah. There are alternatives to divorce, yeah. But these are just some attitudes that I thought were interesting. Yeah, changes.
My parents were separated for years before they actually got divorced.
Yeah. And this doesn't specify fully divorce or just a separation. I don't know the exact, and how people interpret the question when they're asked it and all that, But anyway, so we do see basically more accepting views of various kinds, people not having to be married, more accepting of children to unmarried parents, and more accepting of alternatives when problems are faced in a marriage. But you're right, it did good. Fewer people are recommending divorce than once did. But that jives with the fact that the divorce rate is decreased compared to the 80s or whatever. So like we said, public perception on cohabitation has shifted. The reason for one of our connections, we think the logic, like you were talking about before, is you'd want to live with somebody before you get married because then it's like a trial run. You can practice, understanding what's, what your life will be like when you're married. It allows you to work out the kinks or avoid having to get divorced if there are kinks you can't work out. However, people who are serial cohabitators, people who just live with their partner like all through young adulthood, serial, non-future oriented, and short-lived forms of cohabitation have little in common with marriage. So the kind of cohabitation that you engage in, if you engage in a practice marriage, right, that might help. But just living with somebody who's a romantic partner is not a good preparation for marriage because there's more to marriage than just, chewing habits or whatever. So if you're in a relationship, where you just go from roommate to roommate and you're non-future oriented, thinking of it as short-lived, right? If you're not seeing it as a long-term investment, then it won't help. Cohabitation does not lead to a longer marriage, right? But if you are cohabitating before marriage with an eye to the future and planning, then it can help a marriage. Does that kind of make sense? The way you cohabitate matters, I guess. All right. Let me do one more and then we'll take a break. So the last one for now is non-marital childbearing, which is just a weirdish way that I haven't seen written that way before, but to talk about children being born to unmarried parents. Right, so over 40% of babies born in the U.S. Are born to unmarried parents. Cohabitating couples in their 20s and 30s are largely the group that makes this up, although there's, some people older than that or single people who just choose to have children or whatever. But largely it's people in committed long-term relationships who just don't happen to be married. Across all of these cases, pregnancy actually tends to predate the cohabitation, meaning people don't start living together until they find out they're having a baby. Yeah, right. It kind of creates an incentive to move in together, I guess. It gives people spurs. So the book talks about yesteryear's shotgun marriage, right, is now becoming shotgun cohabitation, right? Instead of marching down the aisle, you march into living together. Is that not arguably what's happening? That makes sense, right? So that's an interesting trend that I found.
Another reason for the increase, and there could be other reasons that led to this, is the fact that people aren't stigmatizing the babies as much.
Correct. There's less fear that your child will grow up.
Right, so that child would have been stigmatized themselves, not the parents. The children are usually the ones being really stigmatized around other kids.
Right.
The parents,
Bastard.
Parents get called this stuff, but they don't get a specific title just because
Correct.
the child would.
Yeah. And if you go way back, bastard children can't inherit land or titles they were very much mistreated, right? So, yeah, basically, right? I would agree. I think a reduced stigma on unmarried parents to a child, on the child, yes, could be one reason parents are less, they don't have to worry about that quite as much, right? Worry about having a child that will be teased or whatever. Also, the general more acceptance might also allow for just more of it to happen. But yeah, I agree. We still need some sort of alarm bell or whatever to get people motivated to move in. But I don't know all the exact numbers on it. I just know it's a general trend. So, other questions or comments about marriage and family and childbirth and how the three work together? All right. So let's take a break here. When we come back, we'll talk about, rather than families as the social problems, we'll also talk about family problems and bigger social problems affecting families and all that. And we'll do our activity at the end. So I'll see everyone, let's say 2:15. All right? So the last thing that the book mentions under the category of types of families that society sees as social problems in various ways, the last one is the bad moms, right? And specifically the idea of society having these standards for what a good mom and a bad mom are, right? Both the idea of you can be, in sociology of deviance we call this rate busting, where you're deviant because you try to follow the norm too closely. So we have a norm in society that you should be a good mother, but there are people who go way overboard, helicopter parenting, right, and that kind of thing. Our society has these incredibly high standards for mothering, right? And women especially are expected to be constantly emotionally available for their children, right? And anyone who can't meet these expectations is seen as a bad mom or a bad dad as well, but to a much lesser extent, this tends to be focused on women. The idea of the welfare mom, right? That kind of conjures the image of irresponsibility, that are characteristics used to blame people in poverty for their poverty, right? Is all part of this kind of mentality. And by suggesting that only certain types of people should be parents or could be good parents, produces a system of stratified reproduction, where we, as a society, we value some women's fertility while we devalue other women's fertility. That particularly poorer women or women of color, racial and ethnic minorities, are often discouraged from having children through policies and things that are meant to, monitor and punish and deter, various kinds of parenting styles, right? That tend to be focused in communities of color or poorer neighborhoods. And that's why there's so much policing of parenthood among the poor as compared to among the rich, right? Most egregiously of this in history, there's a lot of really scary examples of the way society, in particular the government, has treated groups that it deems unfit to have kids. The entire movement called eugenics, which some of you may be familiar with. The eugenics movement was a pseudo-scientific movement in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, into the mid-20th century, meant to prevent the procreation of children who will become a burden on the state. So the idea that eugenics was a movement about genetic purity, basically, but that we should stop people from having children if we know that their children will become a burden on the state. And so in Maine, in 1912, there was an island off the coast of Phippsburg called Malaga Island. I don't know if anyone knows the story of Malaga Island and what happened there, but it was a family, descendants of a family of black sharecroppers from the 1700s who lived on this island, and over generations became a mixed race family, right? So had a former slave sharecropper legacy mixed with marrying white people from the mainland, and they were seen by the local community as feeble-minded and as a burden on the state. And basically the Maine state government kicked everybody off the island and sent them to a home for the feeble-minded, which was an asylum where many of them died. So I have for you a brief video, which now that I've described the story, it's going to be a real cheerful one. On Brightspace, I did also provide, if you're in today's lecture day and you scroll to the bottom, I think, a whole bunch of there's a C-SPAN video from a presentation on the 100-year, remember I said it was 1912, so on the 100-year anniversary, there was a huge C-SPAN thing with the state government about Malaga Island. This Atlas Obscura article is really helpful in explaining the history, but there's no video. And then I put a link to where Malaga Island is now owned by the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, and so they have a thing about it too. Those are all on Brightspace. It's FYI only, but here is the quick story of Malaga Island.
About a century ago, the residents of Malaga Island, a racially mixed settlement just across from Sebasco in Phippsburg, Maine, were removed by order of the state.
The governor of Plaisted made a mistake with this island. He's not here any longer to respond to people and apologize.
Newspapers of the time talk about the shameful disgrace of Malaga. More modern coverage has often been just as untruthful and sensational, calling it Scandal Island. What really happened on Malaga? recently purchased for preservation by the Maine Coast Heritage Trust. The small island is only a half-mile long and a quarter-mile wide and sits very close to the mainland.
So basically, right now, you're looking across the whole north end of the island, and you're looking from this beach right here. This is right beside the Griffin House.
Without digging up or disturbing the site, Nathan Hamilton, an archaeologist from USM, has worked with his colleagues and their students to reconstruct the location and nature of the Malaga settlement.
The house sat. See this little square crown right here? This island has never been plowed. This island has not been disturbed since 1912. That's what makes it a gem. We're looking at John and Rosilla Eason standing in front of their house, and it's sat right on this crown of land. This is the point of land that's coming out that you can see in the distance, right behind the clothesline that matches up exactly with the positioning of this picture.
One of the most common misconceptions, even today, is that the black inhabitants of Malaga were runaway slaves. This is not true. Although people didn't begin living on the island until around 1860, many of the residents were descended from families in the area, some going back to the 1700s and the time of the American Revolution.
This is a community of people who were tied into the local landscape, who found that it was a very strategic point for fishing, and it was also outside of the view of most of the community.
As immigrants flooded the U.S. in the late 1800s, cultural differences raised Anglo-American fears that non-whites would destroy Anglo-Saxon heritage. They used a pseudo-scientific theory called eugenics to justify racism, saying such things as poverty and shiftlessness were inherited racial traits. Even many do-good reformers cited these theories as they worked to clean up slums. Malaga Island began to be seen in this light.
My great-grandfather was Scottish-Irish. Of course, there was people of color. There was the Penobscot Indian, had some representation there. There was a lot of ethnic groups. And it was all people who came together in an integrated society with no place else to go.
When somebody married a half-black, half-white woman, they became an outcast. They became an outcast with their church. A lot has been written about where people were marginalized relative to the communities.
Although most jobs at the time were closed to people of color, several residents found seasonal work on nearby farms and at local resort hotels. In the 1900 census, most Malaga Islanders were listed as making their living from fishing. One, John Eason, worked as a mason.
We're finding lots of materials that indicate special activities. What's happening at Eason's house? There's more food remains, there's more coal from heating. He was permanently there. There's lots of nails from construction.
It's believed that Eliza Griffin took in laundry from the mainland.
Over here at the Griffin house where she was doing laundry and repairing clothes, we found lots of buttons. So we're finding the kind of things that confirm what is the anticipated lifestyle of the individuals living in the houses. There's an awful lot of people that were living on the edge of the Maine coast, and I think there's an awful lot of people that are still right on the edge here today. It's a hard place to make a living. It has been for thousands of years, but it's also got a lot of resources if you tied into them.
The economic situation in Maine worsened at the end of the 1800s. As coastal towns like Phippsburg experienced a downturn in shipbuilding and fishing, jobs were lost. Competition for remaining resources increased, and many more families required financial assistance from their towns. At that time, there were no federal welfare or unemployment programs. Towns had either to raise taxes to care for their poor, hand out supplies, or take the needy into their homes. Phippsburg taxpayers said they just couldn't afford to support the Malaga Islanders. Even as the economic forces of a downturn were affecting the coast, a new economic boom for land developers hit. With steamboat excursions to nearby resorts at Popham Beach, Small Point, Tabasco, and further up the New Meadows River, more and more people visited and then wanted to own a little piece of paradise.
Real estate brokers from Massachusetts and Boston area were looking to set up cottages and sell property, which meant that they had to clean up the landscape a little bit from the locals.
Clean up the landscape.
Although people had been squatting on Maine's unowned islands for centuries, now deeds were produced, islands bought and sold. A possible resort was rumored to be built in the area of Malaga. Along with the increasing prejudice against the islanders caused by the eugenics rhetoric of the time, economic and political forces came to a head for Malaga when Phippsburg claimed that the island was not part of their town.
The island people was costing the town of Phippsburg a lot of money. They thought if they could break the community up and get the people on the mainland, that it would cost the state less money, which we believe in fact was not true. It cost them more to move them off the island than it did if they had stayed on the island.
It was ruled that Phippsburg did have jurisdiction over the island. Around this same time, a missionary, Captain Lane, who summered nearby, got involved in the welfare of Malaga. The Malaga children had been attending school across the channel in Tabasco, but in 1906, Lane and his wife Lucy set up a school on Malaga in a room of the McKinney's house. Within a couple of years, the missionaries built an actual schoolhouse on the island, but as they sent out postcards and messages to raise money, Malaga became even bigger news.
This is something that was grabbed a hold of by Portland and Boston newspapers, and they just didn't seem to want to let this story go. You know, every picture, the terrible conditions of the Negro on Malaga Island.
Ironically, because the newspapers followed each step of the story, Malaga is one of the only examples in the United States of well-documented rural black American life in the early 1900s.
You'll find references to African Americans in the landscape, in the history books, but nothing is told of their story. Because they were marginalized in life and marginalized in history, this case is a bit unique. Because the newspapers focused in on it, it was marginal, but it was documented.
In 1911, Governor Plaisted visited the island and declared that the islanders should be moved. The state bought the island in what was probably an illegal deal and evicted the 33 residents. Each of the families received a small fee, and the island was resold at auction. The Malaga settlement had lasted about 52 years. Since most of the houses had been brought to the island over the ice, they had no foundations and were easy to move. Some residents put their houses on rafts and found new locations for them nearby. Others were met with angry resistance. The buildings not taken away were torn down, except the schoolhouse, which was carried to Loud's Island in Muscongas Bay to become a church. 8 black and Native American residents were institutionalized at Pineland, the main school for the feeble-minded, even though 6 of the 8 were of normal intelligence. The remains of 17 graves from the little cemetery on Malaga were dug up, mixed into 5 coffins, and transferred to the Pineland Cemetery. Ironically, the island was never developed. Fishermen continue to store traps along the shore, but no one has lived on Malaga since.
All right. So that is the story of Malaga, Maine. Incidentally, that last bit of, oh, hang on, sorry, I'm trying to play another video here. Oh shoot, now I lost my train of thought. Put them on rafts, they went up and down looking for houses. Yeah, so it is the Pineland, that's the Pineland Farms in New Gloucester. That is the former home for the main school for the feeble-minded. As soon as I said that. They kicked everybody off, and then they sold it, and then they didn't develop it.
That shocks me.
Yeah.
Like, Palm Beach now is so popular.
Right.
That nobody ever did anything with it ever again.
Right. I mean, once the Maine Coast Heritage Trust bought it, it became a living historical site. But before that, yeah.
Like, no rich person bought the island.
No, and it was arguably the rich people that were the ones that they didn't want to look at it, and so they wanted the people gone. But I remember what I was gonna say. The reason they dug up all the graves, the reason they gave for it, they're like, we want to dig up all the graves so that no one will ever go back there. Like, they didn't want the descendants of the family to resettle the island again. So they exhumed all the bodies, dumped them into 5 coffins, which are marked on the Pineland Farms campus, at the school and all that. It is acknowledged there, but that, doesn't.
All because they were costing too much money.
They were perceived to be costing too much money, yeah.
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 Well, they were just dirty.
Yeah.
Just like I was complaining about wind turbines. Nobody wants to see it. The rich people don't want to see it. So they make sure it doesn't happen. They get rid of it. They put it on the porch. It's not my backyard, not my front, not my site.
Or you could get Phippsburg saying, that's not even our island.
Yeah.
And then the government like, no, it is your island, we don't want to deal with it. So, yeah. There is something to be said for misanthropy, but...
Yeah. It's a simple fact that we would stop having to acknowledge these things if we stop doing them.
We stop doing them in the first place, yeah. And, I mean, this one's pretty egregious that I'm not sure there's anyone looking back and being like, well, they had a point, but there are plenty of those situations too.
There's always going to be offenders.
So, and like they said, this is the only one, or one of the only ones that was documented so well, so we actually know about it, let alone the ones we don't know about or don't realize or whatever. So this was largely because of poverty and because of race. But other types of mothers and fathers can face heightened scrutiny. Yeah, so I, in this class a few semesters ago, I had a student who is deaf and uses sign language to communicate, and she talked a lot about being treated as an unfit mother by the government just because she happens to be deaf, right? And part of the deaf is she's part of the deaf culture. She has a huge support system. Right, she herself happens to be able to read lips and use ASL, but that shouldn't matter which way they communicate. And she was subject to interventions by CPS and other government entities, simply because of her status as being a deaf parent, not because of any wrongdoing on her part.
So Alexander Graham Bell,
the phone guy.
He was eugenicist
Yes, he was.
as well, very against the deaf community.
Yeah.
Created schools specifically that they still exist today that are against the use of ASL and try to force the use of colloquial implants, other devices and means
To make them more like us.
and make them more like normal people. And they continue to push that kind of stuff through CPS and government force. That's why that stuff keeps happening, is because that organization
Still
with
exists.
Alexander Graham Bell's name and his beliefs still pushes that ideal set.
Yeah, isn't Beltone one of the biggest hearing aid companies? Yeah, so, right. And this just happens, I'm talking about women, mothers who are deaf, we haven't, but I mean, any mother who happens to have what society considers a disability in some form, right, faces these heightened scrutinies. And young mothers as well, right, teen parents. Are often treated as moral failures for whether the teen mother is and the father responsible, because it can't be immaculate conception, but whether that was a choice on their part or an accident on their part, it doesn't matter, right? They are treated by society as moral failures. We talk about teen birth rates as a negative sign of a society, or having a high teen birth rate, strictly associating age of pregnancy, first pregnancy, with some sort of moral statement, right? Questions or comments about bad moms?
I remember when I had my first, she lost a little bit of weight, which is normal.
Right.
at first. And my mother-in-law had told me, make sure you feed that baby or your pediatrician's going to call CPS. It was like 5 days postpartum.
And you were a young mother, right? If I could
Yeah, I
put
was
it on the record.
20, and I was like, oh my God, they're going to take my kid from me because she lost half a pound. Like,
Right. Because they've done it before, yeah.
And I'm like, okay, it was a whole thing. And even at like the pediatrician's office, at all the milestone appointments, they have the mom fill out like, are you happy? Do you cry more? And I guess
Screening for sure.
Like catch depression and anxiety, which is fine. But like, imagine if you didn't look the right way and you put too bad answers on there.
Right.
What they could possibly do because they have to report things.
Right, especially if you're a single young mother, right, or without a support system. Not only is there risk there, but the risk that you will lose your child, completely.
Right.
So.
If I answer these questions wrong, are they going to take my kid?
Right.
And there's even one questionnaire now. If you have food, housing, and transportation. So.
Yeah.
It gets tricky. Like you don't want to lie to your pediatrician, but.
Right.
Like.
Transportation especially.
Like having your kids taken away.
The thing is, you're kind of setting the mother up to lie.
Yeah.
Because and what makes it worse is it might be a mother that actually needs
the
help, but she's not going to say that because she's afraid of CPS.
Because saying you need help might be admitting
You're unfit.
You're unfit in some way. Yeah.
The other problem is then you start getting with the technology of, if I lie too much and go too far into a perfect condition, then they're going to say, well, nobody has perfect conditions. There's always something you're struggling with.
Yeah, are they going to dig deeper, Yeah.
Then you start freaking out about that. And
It's people in all of these positions are just so unfairly treated by the system that I do believe there's good people trying to just make sure kids are safe, but the way our system is set up is disproportionately, treating people who are poor, people who are young, people who have disabilities, right, unfairly as compared to some standard of care that we think they should have.
the scary part is the eugenics movement
Is not gone. No, yes, correct. This does exist. Don't Google it. It's really not a good.
There's some people that say if you're on welfare, you should be sterilized.
Correct.
And so, I mean,
calling eugenics a pseudoscience is giving it too much.
It implies there's some affiliation with science of any kind.
Yeah, I think that's even too much.
I mean, it uses scientific terms, which is why I think they call it. Yeah, but yeah. All right. Any other questions or comments on that one for now? Okay. So the next phase of problems that I want to talk about are family-related problems, like problems that affect families or members of families specifically. So the first one the book talks about is one that when I first read it, I was like, oh, this isn't like really seriously still a problem, is it? Right? But it is, and it's child marriage. So child marriage, by this definition, is a marriage between two people where at least one of the people is under the age of 18. Technically, this is legal in many places, including in the U.S., right? Especially for people between like 16 and 18, right? But most states in the U.S. permit child marriage under a few different conditions, depending on the state. Child marriage is most commonly found outside of the U.S., in more developing nations, especially places where life expectancy is much shorter, and so people culturally think they need to get married very quickly. But in the U.S., the states that do permit child marriage under certain conditions, the conditions usually include either parental consent or the approval of a judge. If the child is pregnant, and I'm using the word child here just to mean under 18, right? But if in some states that makes it okay for them to get married, southern states probably. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on the South exactly, but for the same reason that marriages were sort of declared between people to keep the religious community satisfied, right? Places where children, people under 18 are impregnated, Oftentimes, they're permitted to get married in that extenuating circumstances, so at least they're married. Or pregnancy resulting from statutory rape. Those are the conditions most commonly used to permit marriage between someone who's under 18 and somebody else. Specifically, the reason it's a social problem is the earlier people get married, the higher their rates of dropping out of school, early pregnancy, and that if they are a childbearing person. If not, then it means like that they're impregnated somebody who has become pregnant early. Domestic violence is more common in these marriages, and mental health issues. One of the things from my perspective that makes child marriage such a problem has nothing to do with the marriage itself. It has to do with the fact that people under the age of 18 do not have legal status in this country, right? If you are not legally allowed to vote or to own property or to, I guess you could drive a car technically, but
Medical help with
seek medical help, yeah, without a parent or guardian, right? If you're not able to do those things legally, you should not be able to enter into a marriage contract with another person either. You don't have protections. Oftentimes, family property is in the adult spouse's name. So if someone under 18 marries somebody over 18, all of the communal property has to be in the over 18 person's name, which means that the under 18 person does not get the benefit of owning property, right? Domestic violence shelters do not provide services to unaccompanied minors, right? So if you are a 17-year-old and you are the victim of domestic violence from your 19-year-old spouse, you cannot go to a domestic violence shelter.
But I didn't know that.
Most of them. I'm sure there must be emergency shelters that deal with people in these situations, but the general rule for domestic violence shelters is no one unaccompanied.
CPS.
Right, so they call the state, and then then it's the whole system thing, and right. So, and who do you send that person back to? Not their parents, their spouse, which is the person that they are trying to escape, right?
If it's someone who's been, like, I'll think of it.
Well, this is related, so this might job, but you can't get a protective order against somebody unless you are an adult as well, right? So like if in the case of someone under 18, you would have to get your parents or whatever to file that restraining order on your behalf. So literally in these, violent situations, children in a marriage are unprotected. And from my perspective, that's the problem. It's not even about how old they are and whether they should choose to get married at the point. It's that you shouldn't be married if you don't have the legal protections that come with, marriage and legal status.
The other problem I have is that a lot of times, like I said, it's parental consent. If the parents consented to the marriage in a lot of cases like this,
Yeah.
from a cultural standpoint, so this child spouse thing is very common in Islamic countries, and so their parents are usually the ones that help arrange
the marriage.
happening. They can't go to their parents for help in the case of abuse or violence.
Right.
And so they're stuck in this trap.
Right.
And on top of that, in a lot of cases, the child's not going to say no to their parents if their parents are consenting to marriage.
Right.
In this case, they could be arranging it without the child's
Awareness at all, yeah.
awareness or consent in the issue at all.
Right.
So it's kind of.
And right, so you go from being a child who cannot consent to a person in an adult situation who has no legal status.
And then if those
And still can't
people-
consent.
And still can't consent, right.
But now at this point, you're forced into possibly a sexual relationship
Right.
without protections, legal protections.
Correct.
And then if they have children, then there's legal things that come with like custody, like if you're a minor.
Yeah.
Trying to get custody of your kid is going to be hard to like fight an adult with yourself.
Right. If you're 17 and wanting custody of your child and your partner is 21 and has a job or whatever, and like, absolutely, right.
It's, Qatar, I'm trying to remember, one of the country is 13 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
For marriage, and so that could translate over here. They could move over here.
Right. So an overseas marriage often is honored, right, in the U.S. So yeah.
So it's insane to think about that. That a 13-year-old could be married to somebody who's in their 20s.
I'm pretty sure some states in the U.S. it's 14. It's not that much older. I mean, but yeah, I don't know which ones and I don't know exactly. But you know, it ranges from 14 to 18.
The other problem I have is pregnancy resulting from statutory rape.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So that concept of marrying your rapist.
Correct. That's exactly what it is. And so that was from the last slide. Just one of the reasons that states would allow it. These the pregnancy-related ones are purely politically oriented, where the goal is to change the status of something on paper so that it is more acceptable, right? But does not protect the child, does not protect the child's child, right, or any of those things. So I concur. So this is a social problem that is unique to family-related issues, right? Marriage, children, that's the idea. So I don't have a solution right now, but that any other questions about that one for now as a problem?
Well, I'm just gonna think like a whole other factor. Like, what if you like 6 years and emancipated?
That's different. So, well, no, I don't know. When you seek emancipation, I don't know which things you're allowed to access that are usually not reserved for adults, like owning property and things like that. Like there's some legal rights are granted to emancipated minors, but most of them, they're still minors.
Yeah.
So.
Or just like it continues like your parents' permission, or like they're just like curious of how that would.
Right. So for this one.
Just like curious how that would.
So for this one, I would imagine if they required parental consent, if you lived in a state where they did and you were emancipated, then it would just be your decision, right? Or the legal guardian that you were appointed to in lieu of your parents, if you know.
Or approval of the
Or the approval of the judge.
Or on like the flip side of it, like you are in a situation getting out of and you were emancipated, but then you couldn't, would you be able to go domestic violence shelter if you're emancipated?
But as an unaccompanied minor, and I just don't know the answer to that. But yeah, right.
You brought that up, and I was like, wait, that's.
I mean, you could probably still get away with, at least for a little while, lying.
Correct.
About your age and
Correct.
situation.
For a night or whatever.
Yeah. For a couple nights.
I think you're gonna run into the unfortunate situation where technically it would probably be legal, but it would involve you proving emancipation, and so.
And you carry that in your back pocket when you're escaping.
The domestic violence situation and stopping the ground to pay for it.
Correct. And all of that is inherent in the fact that children are not legal adults, and so
People that don't have someone, like, at-risk youth and people who don't have someone to help them or have them or look after them, that are people that are most at risk.
Absolutely. And to your point, domestic violence can affect anyone of any age, whether they're legally married as children or not. So these issues are still factors, whether we're talking about marriage in the context of a marriage or just a romantic partnership or whatever. Dating violence could occur between two, a young person.
I think we'll just make it illegal.
Make what legal?
Child marriage.
It kind of is.
In all situations.
Because children lack that legal status. We don't want them.
Legal or illegal?
Make it
Oh, make it illegal.
Everybody's like,
I mean, that's one
I'm not
approach.
a great person, but I'm not happy with it. No, illegal, sorry.
Yeah, okay, so right.
Across the board, completely illegal.
I agree personally, but I think socially there are questions of freedom of expression and religious expression, right? Like if I want to arrange a marriage between my, religious purposes between my child and someone else.
I mean, like that guy here. But if we can all agree as a society that if you're under 18, you can't decide who the president is for the next 4 years.
Yeah.
You don't get to pick the person you're going to spend the rest of your life with.
I hear you.
There's a lot of age restriction stuff. You're allowed to vote, you're allowed to join the military.
You can drink now.
You can drink or smoke.
You can't even go watch an R-rated movie and you're talking about getting married.
Correct. I hear you.
Shit to me.
So what I think we can agree on is the current situation is a problem.
Oh.
Whether the fully criminalizing it would solve that, I don't know, or other problems would crop up, or I guess on the other side of the coin, fully decriminalizing it, which is not what you were asking, but.
What also is insane is talking about the children's right to legal status. The fact that parents of a certain point can take out debt in their children's name.
That's embarrassing.
Yeah.
They do it and they ruin their kids' credits.
Yeah.
You know what else you can do though? You can add your kids to your credit cards, and I've done this, so that when they enter adulthood, they
Build
have a
credit.
credit score, you know?
Yeah.
But I agree, and a lot of
On the
people.
backside.
Why it was started, but then there's the ones who abuse it,
Yeah.
trash their kids'
It's
credit.
credits.
Yeah, or they can even.
Yeah.
No, right, because the whole child pregnancy and pregnancy result in statutory rate,
Uh-huh.
that kind of seems to me like a long, convoluted way of making having sex with a child legal.
I can see how that could be framed that way. Yes, I don't know what the purposes behind the law were exactly, but
When you're talking about,
Age of consent, is it 14 or 15?
depends on the age of your partner. But I think 14.
but when you're talking about statutory, that involves one of the partners being an adult.
Or 5 years older than the partner. But yeah, sorry, just
Even if that's the case, that person needs to
Yeah.
go to jail. I'm just saying.
5 years under. Yeah, because that would be 13 and 18.
Yeah.
Well, let's just put this in perspective a little bit. Incest is not illegal in all states in the United States.
Correct.
Between parent and child isn't even
No.
illegal in all states. So it's like, yeah, we got this, but that we haven't even fixed that problem yet.
No, I said it a few times now. Humans are garbage. I get that.
I hope that's not the tagline for this class, though. Welcome to social problems where humans are garbage.
It's always dumpster fire.
So I looked it up just because I was curious.
Yeah.
In Maine, the age of consent is 16, so if anyone engaging in sexual activity with someone it doesn't matter.
15 or younger.
So it
Gotcha.
doesn't matter the age difference between them. It's just
Okay.
like if you have a boyfriend who's 16 or 17, and you're pregnant,
Right.
doesn't matter if they're 5 years or 2 years old.
Right. I guess I know they can be charged with a crime differently if there's 5 years difference, but if you're under and they're more than 5 years, but once 16, anyone over 16, then it's their own choice. But yeah.
Don't forget the 15-year-olds that sex to each other and they both get child pornography.
I know.
All right.
Just I have to go back there. So what you're telling me is in the state of Maine, it's legal for like a 50-year-old to have sex with a 16-year-old.
Correct. A sexual relationship. Yeah.
Unless there's a limit.
Yeah, it doesn't allow any as being garbage.
But that's not new. I mean, that's true nationally too, for the most part. I mean,
Say that, oh yeah, but that's still cool.
yeah, like the 16-year-old who married the older guy. Courtney Stodden was her name. I don't remember.
Doug Hutchinson.
Thank you. So you know, yeah, it happens. It's legal. Is it socially accepted? No, I don't think it is.
Opens up the other
Yeah.
concepts of the fact that her mom approved of it.
Yeah, right. That was the parental
And
approval.
was a
Yeah.
garbage human being
Yeah.
alone at the house.
Parents can sell their children too if you call it a marriage and a dowry. Yeah.
Maybe they were involved. I don't know. I'm just saying. Money's money. People do that crazy things.
All right, so I hesitate to move on to the next topic because it's violence and you know this is a serious this one's serious, obviously they all are, but I am not an expert in this area, but I know there are a lot of mental health and human services majors, and some of you may know a little bit more about the legal status of some of these things. But in general, the kinds of violence that are most commonly observed in families include child abuse or neglect. Neglect being more common than abuse, which is acts or failure to act that presents risk of serious harm to children. At a minimum, we know that child abuse is unreported most significantly. The reports we do have about child abuse are only a segment of how many times it actually happens. And of course, abuse and neglect can take a lot of different forms. It's not always just an overt physical abuse that is visible to everyone and can be reported easily. Psychological abuse, various kinds of neglect are a little bit harder sometimes to notice and certainly to report. But the point here is the idea of the imminent risk of harm to a child. I don't think I have to state how, that this is a problem that affects families. Related to this is the next one, which is elder abuse. But is there any questions about this and how it is a social problem facing families? So related to this, just at the other end of the age spectrum, is elder abuse. Right, many times families include extended families and older generations. So elder abuse is physical, emotional, or sexual maltreatment of older adults. This kind of abuse we hear sometimes about occurring in an institutional setting, like a nursing home or something like that, but it can also happen in family settings. Sometimes caregivers become mentally or emotionally drained and lash out at their charges, the person for whom they're taking care. In general, those who commit elder abuse on average tend to be socially isolated with histories of substance abuse or mental or physical health troubles, or stress related to financial difficulties. So one of the other forms of abuse that is not physical necessarily or emotional or sexual is financial abuse, financial exploitation of elders. So, taking away people's money or controlling their money when it's not yours to control, or neglecting to, give people access to their money and that sort of thing as well is another form of abuse. Questions about that one or why it's a problem for families? All right, the last one I want to talk about is intimate partner violence. I mentioned domestic violence earlier, which domestic violence is a category that includes child abuse, elder abuse, and intimate partner violence. It's sort of a bigger category, but intimate partner violence, as its name suggests, is violence that occurs within a current or a former romantic relationship with an intimate partner, in other words. This can include physical violence, but it can also include things like threats or coercive threats, economic, financial abuse, emotional abuse, stalking and harassment, those kinds of things. In general, women are more likely to be the targets of intimate partner violence, but that does not mean that men can't also be targeted. And while men are more likely to perpetrate intimate partner violence, there is also certainly cases of women as well being the perpetrator. And one other term that I learned when I started teaching this course was situational couple violence, which is where the intimate partner violence is two-sided, where both partners are engaging in violent actions against each other, which is often a form of intimate partner violence that it tends not to escalate in the same way that intimate partner violence does, where intimate partner violence, early cases of threats or emotional abuse will escalate to physical violence, and often, it can be including homicide. Situational couple violence doesn't tend to escalate in severity, although it can escalate in frequency. But that couples sort of are matched in their level of frustration, anger, emotional, state, I guess. I'm not saying that it's blameless and doesn't cause any issues. Obviously, if you're in a relationship where you're constantly fighting, the emotional toll is significant. But it's just an interesting, a different way of thinking about intimate partner violence when it's two partners involved in it simultaneously or equally. Also, it tends to be more verbal violence and less physical, although it can, of course, it involve physical violence. So what leads to intimate partner violence? What are the causes of intimate partner violence? I think I listed these in the outline, so you don't have to write them all down because there's a bunch and they're really small. And again, we offer courses in the Human Services program specifically about family violence and how these specific causes lead directly to the violence. But oftentimes it's victims of abuse or people who have behavioral problems in childhood grow up to engage in violence either as their way of learning how to deal with problems or whatever. People with aggressive friends, people facing stress from unemployment or other financial burdens, people with hostile attitudes towards women, and of course drug abuse can also fuel violence. The problem, one of the major problems with the violence, other than the violence itself, is that intimate partner violence in particular is often treated by the government / law enforcement as a non-criminal private matter. Like, oh, this is a disturbance, or at least it historically has been, right? This is a family issue, right? This is you need to work this out on your own unless it leads to some sort of life-threatening injury or death. But starting in the late 1970s, the feminist movement and other groups tried to raise awareness about intimate partner violence as, no, there are warning signs that lead to death, right? And we can draw this connection. And so that when we see these things happening, we can't just write it off as some problem to be dealt with, in a private, behind closed doors kind of situation. And that's actually the same social movement that resulted in the first, what were called at the time battered women's shelters, but domestic violence shelters and things. So how do we address intimate partner violence as a society? By addressing the root causes. There is a law on intimate partner violence in the U.S., right? You are not meant to engage in violence. But just having the law doesn't change the behaviors, and it certainly doesn't address any of these causes. And so there are a large number of social movements and movement organizations that are committed to reducing intimate partner violence, and they focus, these kinds of organizations they either focus on interventions or preventions, right, to sort of stop violence before it starts or escalates. I mentioned the feminist movement being one of them, and National Organization for Women was another, but these are by no means the only ones. Those are just two large ones. Questions or comments about violence and families in general? Yes?
Just in the definition where you mentioned current or former.
Yes.
Is there a time limit on the former?
No, I believe the idea is just that it's someone you know and have had a relationship with, as opposed to, of course, a stranger, or just an acquaintance. So I don't believe there's a time in the law anyway. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm actually going to end it here, but anyway, so thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.